Before the sun comes up in 1839, a Chinese official stands at the edge of the Pearl River and listens to small waves slap the mud. In front of him is a wall of wooden chests stacked high enough to feel like a fort. No gold, no rifles, no grain for an army. Opium. Thousands of chests worth a fortune, and worth something worse than money. He knows what he is about to do will travel farther than any messenger on horseback, because the moment he destroys this cargo, the argument will not stay in Canton. It will reach London, it will reach India, and it will end up on the decks of warships. He is making a bet that could steady his country's finances, or pull it into a war, and may not be able to control. And the terrifying part is, he will not know which one he chose until the horizon fills with sails and smoke. Hold that picture, because the Opium Wars are usually told like a clash of cultures or a collision of pride. But the fuse was much quieter. One side tried to force a loss onto the other, and the other side decided it would rather change the rules than take the hit. There is one promise in this story that matters more than speeches, more than flags, even more than the opium itself, and once you see that promise for what it was, you will never look at trade disputes the same way again. If you want more stories where history makes financial sense, and the incentives are the real characters, take a second and subscribe to Stay Financial Historian. Because we are going to follow the money all the way to the moment the cannons answer, and we are starting with something that sounds harmless enough to be boring. Tea. In early 19th century Britain, tea was not a cute luxury. It was routine. It was warmth and habit and a daily comfort that crossed class lines, and it created a national appetite Britain could not feed from its own soil. China could. China also had silk and porcelain, goods Europeans craved and could not reproduce at the same quality yet, and the Qing Empire was willing to sell, but it was not interested in buying very much from Britain in return. That single imbalance mattered because in that era you could not settle a giant trade gap with a line of credit and a confidence game. You settled it with silver, real metal, loaded into chests, shipped across oceans, and handed over at the port. Each year, Britain bought more tea, and each year more silver slid out of British hands and into China. People today talk about deficits like they are just opinions in a debate. But back then, silver was capacity. Silver was reserve. Silver was the difference between an empire that could fund a war and an empire that had to hesitate. And if you are Britain, watching silver flow out to satisfy a consumer habit, you start asking a question that sounds polite in public and ruthless in private. How do we stop paying for this in silver? At first Britain tried the respectable fixes. Diplomats went east with gifts and letters. Merchants tried to sell woolens, metal goods, tools, clocks, and clever machines. But the king court did not feel dependent on Western products. China was huge, productive, and confident enough to keep foreigners at arm's length. Trade was allowed, but controlled, and the control mattered. Foreign merchants were largely confined to a system centered on Canton in the south. They lived in walled trading compounds and did business through approved Chinese merchants under strict rules. From the king perspective, this was not an insult. It was stability. Keep outsiders in one lane, monitor the flow, collect the tax, prevent chaos from spilling into the wider empire. From the British merchant perspective, it felt like doing business through a narrow gate while the money streamed out and the door to wider access stayed locked. That frustration is important, but the real pressure came from the ledger. Britain needed Chinese goods. China did not need British goods. So Britain paid in silver, and Britain did not want to bleed silver forever. Here is where the story turns dark, because Britain had an empire asset that could produce a commodity China would buy even if the king government hated it. That asset was India. The British East India Company was not just a business with offices and paperwork. It was a state in all but name, with an army, a tax system, and the power to reshape entire regions' crops. In parts of India, the company could push farmers toward poppy cultivation, purchase the raw opium on its terms, process it, and sell it at auctions to merchants who would ship it east. Opium existed in China already in small amounts, sometimes used as medicine, sometimes as a vice, and the king state had tried to restrict it before. What changed was scale and organization. The company and its partners helped turn opium into a pipeline, steady enough to be counted on like any other export. The financial logic was brutally simple. If China would not buy British textiles or tools, China might still buy opium, not because it was useful, but because it was addictive. Once addiction spreads, demand does not need persuasion. It needs supply. And once demand is strong enough, the silver reverses direction. Tea still flows to Britain, but now Chinese buyers are paying silver for opium, and that silver can be used to buy tea without draining Britain is reserves. That is why this war is best understood as a geopolitical margin call, not because it is cute to use market language, but because one side built a structure that depended on a toxic flow continuing, and when the other side tried to cut it off, the response was not a polite adjustment, it was force. But do not picture this as a simple villain story where a government in London openly ships narcotics into China and laughs about it. The system worked because responsibility was distributed. Opium was grown and processed in India. It was sold at auctions to private merchants. Those merchants shipped it toward China and along the Chinese coast. It often did not enter like a legal cargo. It hovered offshore, moved through islands and hidden anchorages, and slipped into rivers and creeks on fast boats that knew the coastline like a map of escape routes. One notorious staging area was near Linton Island, where large ships could anchor like floating warehouses while Chinese smugglers handled the risky last miles. That distance created a convenient story for everyone who wanted one. Foreign merchants could pretend they were just selling a commodity offshore. The king could pretend it was a manageable smuggling problem rather than an international crisis. Local officials could pretend their bribes were just fees, and Chinese users could pretend it was only a personal habit. But inside China, the consequences did not stay personal for long. Opium spread through port districts first, among laborers and sailors who lived hard lives and were eager for any escape, and then it climbed into clerks, soldiers, and officials. And when officials become consumers, enforcement turns into compromise. Imagine a clerk responsible for inspecting cargo who has not slept well in weeks because he needs the pipe. Imagine a local commander who knows the law and knows the smugglers, and knows that stopping them would cost him allies and bribe money and maybe even his position. The trade did not just bring addiction, it brought corrosion, and the money effects were just as dangerous, especially because they hit people who never touched the drug. China's economy used both copper and silver in different roles. Copper coins were common in daily life. Silver mattered for larger payments, and in many places, taxes. When opium pulled silver out of the country, silver became harder to get. When silver is harder to get, it becomes more expensive relative to copper. Here is what that means without any fancy language. Picture a farmer who sells rice and earns copper. His taxes are assessed in silver. Last year, he could trade one string of copper coins for enough silver to pay his tax. This year, because silver is scarcer, he needs 2 strings. His harvest did not shrink, but his tax burden just doubled in real terms. Now picture that happening not to one farmer, but to millions. That is how a financial problem turns into social pressure, and social pressure turns into political risk. It is borrowing from neighbors. It is selling grain early. It is hiding coins. It is resentment spreading from village to village. The king court saw these pressures stacking up: addiction, corruption, silver drain, tax stress, and the growing sense that foreigners were gaming the system while Chinese society paid the price. The Daoguang emperor needed someone who would act when others hesitated. He chose Lin Zexu. Lin was not famous for charm. He was famous for discipline. In an empire where many officials could be bought, Lin had a reputation for being hard to bend. When he arrived in Canton, he did not move like a man looking for compromise. He moved like a man shutting down an illegal operation that was killing the neighborhood. He targeted Chinese dealers and collaborators first, because foreign merchants could not distribute opium without local networks. Arrests followed, confiscations followed, fear followed. Then Lin turned to the foreigners, and he demanded the one thing they believed would always be negotiable: the opium itself. Not a token amount, not a promise to behave. The cargo. Imagine the foreign trading compounds in Canton then, the factories where Western merchants lived and stored goods. The walls that once felt like protection started to feel like a trap. Merchants looked at their warehouses and saw not just profit, but survival. Opium chests were capital. They were collateral. They were the thing you borrowed against, and the thing your partners expected you to turn into silver. Losing them meant more than a bad season. It could mean collapse. Lin tightened the screws. Trade was restricted. Supplies were controlled. Foreign merchants found themselves effectively contained while pressure built day by day. Food deliveries slowed. Tempers sharpened. Letters were written in panic. Some tried to bluff. Some tried to bargain. Lin did not blink, because he understood that ports are not only markets. Ports are choke points, and whoever controls the choke point controls the negotiation. Now, we reach the promise that turns a contraband dispute into a national obligation. The British official overseeing trade, Charles Elliot, faced a brutal choice. If he let private merchants take the loss, powerful interests back home would howl, and the foreign community in Canton might splinter into chaos. If he pulled the British government into it, he could keep merchants united and calm, but he would turn the destroyed opium into a political issue Britain would feel compelled to answer. Elliot chose the guarantee. He told the merchants that if they surrendered their opium, the British government would compensate them later. In the moment, it probably sounded like a way to prevent violence and keep order. In hindsight, it reads like a fuse being lit. Because once a government promises to cover a private loss, the loss stops being private. Now, the opium is not merely illegal cargo that merchants should have known was risky. It becomes property the British state has effectively insured. And when that insured property is seized and destroyed, the state feels pressured to respond, not just to protect money, but to protect credibility. The merchants handed over the chests. Lin took them. And then Lin did what he believed a sovereign state must do if the law is going to mean anything. He destroyed the opium publicly and completely. The chests were opened. The opium was mixed with lime and salt. It became a ruined slurry and was dumped so it could never be recovered. The water turned cloudy. The smell turned bitter and chemical. Workers watched. Soldiers guarded. The message was clear. The king state was willing to take pain now to stop a deeper collapse later. Lin also sent a moral challenge outward, asking why Britain banned opium at home, but profited from selling it in China. It was a clean question, but clean questions do not always beat dirty incentives. In Britain, the story was reframed. It was not our traders were caught selling poison. It became British property was seized. British subjects were mistreated. British trade was obstructed. That reframing mattered because it gave leaders a language that sounded noble while defending something ugly, and it made accepting the loss feel like accepting humiliation. The first British warships did not arrive because every person in London craved opium profits. They arrived because the British state now had a promise to honor, a claim to pursue, and a fear of looking weak in front of rivals. Once again, the trigger was not a burst of emotion on a battlefield. It was a financial commitment that pulled national power into a private trade. When fighting began, the mismatch was hard to ignore. China had manpower, tradition, and local knowledge. Britain had industrial-era ships, modern artillery, trained crews, and the logistics to keep pressure on distant coasts. Britain's strategy was not to conquer all of China. It was to apply force where it hurt the king state's revenue and legitimacy: ports, coastal cities, trade routes, strategic waterways. It was pressure designed to raise the cost of resistance until the king court signed. Inside the king government, factions argued. Some wanted firmness. Some wanted containment. Some wanted to blame local officials and pretend the crisis could be managed with replacements and edicts. That indecision mattered because it produced half measures, and half measures invite harsher demands. By 1842, under mounting pressure, the king signed the Treaty of Nanking. Here's the part where people's eyes glaze over because treaties sound like paperwork, but the consequences were physical. China paid a large indemnity, money raised through taxes and pressure that fell on ordinary people. China ceded Hong Kong, giving Britain a permanent foothold at the edge of the trade system. Several ports were open to foreign trade, not as a friendly exchange, but as a requirement. Tariffs were constrained. limiting China's ability to use trade policy to raise revenue or protect itself. And perhaps most corrosive, foreign legal privileges expanded in ways that made enforcement uneven inside China. When the law is not applied equally, people notice. Chinese merchants competed under one set of rules while foreigners often operated under protections Chinese citizens did not enjoy. That unevenness did not just offend pride. It weakened the state's grip on order, and order is what holds a huge empire together. The First War ended, but the crisis did not disappear. Opium kept moving. Silver pressure continued. Corruption did not vanish. And now, the king state had treaty obligations layered on top of internal unrest. This is where history often gets told like a montage, so instead of throwing a pile of names at you, picture the king court after 1842 as a room full of exhausted officials trying to manage three fires at once. One fire is the border and the coast, where foreigners can now demand access with the threat of force. One fire is the treasury, where indemnities and constrained tariffs squeeze revenue. One fire is the countryside, where rebellion and famine and resentment can flare. In that situation, every decision feels like a sacrifice. Enforce the law hard and risk foreign retaliation, or tolerate violations and watch legitimacy rot. By the 1850s, internal catastrophe erupted, including the Taiping Rebellion, a civil war so massive it tore through the tax base and manpower the king needed to function. While the king struggled to keep its own territory from breaking apart, foreign powers pressed for more, not because they were all identical villains, but because the treaty system created a simple incentive. If you can demand expanded rights and face limited consequences, you demand them. Disputes piled up in ports and rivers, often over symbols that stood in for bigger issues: flags, paperwork, arrests, access, and whether Chinese officials had violated treaty rights. One flashpoint was the Arrow incident in 1856, when Chinese officials boarded a vessel tied to Hong Kong registration and removed men they considered criminals. To British officials, it was framed as an insult to treaty status. To the king's side, it was framed as law enforcement. The details were messy, which is exactly why the incident worked as a pretext. Messy incidents can be shaped into clean stories. Another trigger was the killing of a missionary, which France used as justification to join a new campaign. Again, the spark matters less than the fuel. The fuel was that foreign governments wanted expanded privileges, wider access, and stronger protections for their people and commerce, and the king court wanted to contain the damage without admitting it had lost control. Britain and France launched the Second Opium War, and the pattern repeated with higher stakes. Coastal defenses that seemed strong in theory fell under modern bombardment. Negotiations collapsed. Armies moved. The king tried to bargain, stall, resist, and sometimes fight, but it was doing so while its internal stability was already bleeding. Then came an act designed to scar memory. In 1860, Anglo-French forces looted and burned the Summer Palace complex outside Beijing. It was not just military pressure, it was psychological pressure. It said the court's sacred spaces were reachable, and it said the cost of defiance would be paid in humiliation as well as money. The treaties that followed expanded foreign rights, opened more doors, deepened diplomatic presence, and tightened the constraints on king control. Under this new reality, opium moved closer to open legality, not because the king suddenly approved of it, but because the king had lost the power to enforce its ban against outsiders backed by Canton and treaty. If you step back now, you can see why calling this a geopolitical margin call is not just branding. Britain had built a structure that helped balance imperial finances, especially through revenue tied to India and trade routes that fed the empire's broader budget. China tried to shut down the flow that made that structure work. When the call came, Britain chose force over accepting the loss. And China, facing foreign pressure and internal fracture, could not absorb the shock without losing control elsewhere. But the most important part of this story is not only what governments did, it is what the machine did to people who never got a vote. In southern China, dock workers watched neighbors lose months of wages to the pipe, then watched the same men show up to haul cargo because hunger does not care about shame. In villages, families hid copper coins because they did not know what the tax collector would demand once silver got more expensive. Local smugglers ran shipments because a few successful trips could feed a family for a year, even if the risk was prison or death. King officials faced a trap that would break weaker men. Enforce hard and you might spark unrest or foreign retaliation. Look away and you grow a corruption so deep you cannot enforce anything later. In India, farmers were pressured toward poppy cultivation because the crop that paid was the crop the company demanded, and that could mean less land for food and more dependence on prices they did not control. The opium economy survived because it rewarded enough people in the chain to keep it alive, and it punished enough people outside the chain to keep them quiet. After the wars, treaty ports grew into strange hybrid spaces where foreign firms, banks, and shipping companies could operate with protections that did not apply evenly to Chinese businesses. Trade expanded, but it expanded on terms that reduced king control over tariffs and law, which meant the government had less flexibility to raise money just as it needed more money to rebuild, modernize defenses, and suppress rebellions. Reformers tried. They built arsenals and shipyards. They founded schools. They imported machines and hired advisors. They tried to learn the tools of industrial power without surrendering identity. But reform under pressure is expensive, and the king state's revenue system was already strained. Each improvement required money. Money required taxes. Taxes required legitimacy. Legitimacy was exactly what the opium crisis and the treaty system had weakened. Over time, memory hardened. In China, the Opium Wars became a reference point for humiliation and warning, a story about how foreigners used trade language to carve out privileges. In Britain, the wars were often remembered through the lens of empire and commerce, sometimes softened by distance, sometimes justified by the idea that opening markets was progress. Different stories grew out of the same events, and those stories mattered because nations act on what they believe happened. If you are watching from the United States, it is fair to ask the hard question, was not China restrictive, and did not broader trade eventually bring benefits? The honest answer is that trade can be a bridge, and it can be a crowbar. When the commodity is addictive, consent is compromised. When enforcement is naval bombardment, the agreement is not a clean agreement. That does not make the king system flawless. It had corruption and rigidity and blind spots, and those weaknesses made it easier for outsiders to apply pressure. But it does mean the method matters, because the method shaped the century that followed, expanding foreign footholds, reform attempts under constraint, internal instability, and the slow erosion of confidence in the dynasty until it finally fell in 1911. And if there is a reason this story keeps echoing into the present, it is not because history repeats in costume, it is because incentives repeat in new tools. When a major economic flow becomes essential to one side, and the other side tries to shut it down, the conflict stops being about manners and starts being about survival inside the system each side depends on. Sometimes the tools are warships. Sometimes they are sanctions, shipping controls, or financial restrictions. The tools change, but the tension is familiar. Who gets to set the terms when a profitable flow is threatened, and who gets stuck eating the loss when the flow breaks? If you know someone who thinks wars mostly start because leaders get emotional or insulted, share this with them. Because the Opium Wars are proof that a war can begin like a boardroom problem. A guarantee gets issued, a loss gets forced, and national power gets used to make the numbers work again. Now, I want to put you back on that shoreline, not as a history trivia moment, but as a real choice. Lin Zexu is staring at chests that represent poison in the streets, silver draining out of the economy, and officials quietly selling out the lore. Destroying them might save the country from a deeper collapse. It might also trigger retaliation he cannot stop. So here is your call. If you were Lin, would you destroy the opium anyway? Yes or no, and why? Drop that in the comments, and if you want to go one step deeper, tell me what you think was the true turning point. Lin's crackdown, Elliot's guarantee, the first treaty, or the decision to burn the summer palace. Because the uncomfortable lesson is that every obvious choice in this story carried a hidden cost, and the people living through it did not get to see the full price tag until it was too late. And here's the last image I want to leave you with, because it is the one that should make you uneasy. The chests are open. The opium is ruined. The water is cloudy, and for a brief moment it feels like the law has returned, like sovereignty has been defended, like the empire has proved it still has a spine. But across the ocean, in counting houses and government offices, another calculation is being made, one that does not measure shame or addiction, only precedent and payout. And that is why the story does not really end in 1860 or 1911. Somewhere in every era, there is always another set of chests sitting at the edge of someone's board, or another flow that props up someone's budget, and the real question is never whether pressure will come, it is who will be told to take the loss when it does, and what they will risk burning, so they do not have to.